Now, this was then combined with my interest in the difference between East and West. And so I gravitated toward political philosophy, although that was never the only thing, because I was always convinced that unless political philosophical ideas are well grounded in other branches of philosophy, they're going to fall down and they're never going to make it, you know. So I did my share of metaphysics and my share of epistemology, and did battle with the positivists, with A.J. Ayer, with all of these guys. And I finally wrote my doctoral dissertation on the meta-ethical topic of human rights and meta-ethical inquiry, because back in the late 60s and 70s, there was still a very strong strain of emotivism when it came to normative fields. People in political philosophy kept saying things like, when I say freedom is best, all I mean is here's where I stand, not that anything is true or false. And I said, that's not enough. And you know, everybody else was beginning to think that when they opposed the Vietnam War, they didn't just express emotions. They were probably trying to say something that was true. And so I took on this subject. Now, it's a very bad idea. I don't advise anybody who's in graduate school to take on a major philosophical issue to do their dissertations in. I had to do 8 versions of this because my professors resisted everything until I sat them down and I said, here is one chapter, here's another chapter, here's another chapter, and we went by each one of them meticulously until they finally passed me. Because most people do their dissertations who are smart on comparing Heidegger with Jaspers or Wittgenstein with or Austin or Rawls with, I don't know, Dworkin or something. And that's a kind of cheap way of doing it, but it's also the best way to do it because you don't want to get bogged down in your dissertation. This is not your magnum opus. Turns out I wrote it as my magnum opus. And it prepared me to write a lot of other stuff on rights theory, you know. And because I really do think that when it comes to politics, you need to find out what are the most fundamental principles of human community organization, how the law ought to be fashioned, what a constitution should include, and so on. And so that's the way I was going. But not exclusively, because I also got involved in ethics, and I wrote on epistemology. Very early, I was writing in defense of objectivity along objectivist lines. And but even there, I was not so much interested in objectivism, but interested in objectivity. I was concerned with, when I'm looking at that camera, am I able to tell that there's a camera there? Or am I inventing a camera? Or is some cultural influence making me say there's a camera there? All of this thing interested me intrinsically, independently of my fascination of Atlas Shrugged or, you know, anything like that. And in fact, I had a little bit of a problem with some of the early objectivist philosophers, because I always thought that they were too eager to repeat the words of Ayn Rand. And their loyalty to Rand's ideas, or their admiration for her ideas, tended to issue in parroting her ideas and not being able to move away from them unless in the back of their head the ghost of Ayn Rand approved, you know. And so I was not interested in that. I was a little bit more of a loose cannon. In fact, almost all of the people who were fond of Rand and became kind of organized Randians, like ARI and then later on Atlas, tended to treat me as, I'm not sure we can trust McCann because he's just sort of flying on his own. I never had any problem trusting me because I sort of understood that I was well grounded. I may not have used the exact same words, but the ideas were there. And that's one of the reasons I say that I think in the last analysis, I'm probably still closer to her than most of the others. After Claremont, I went to NYU. I got an MA there, and my MA advisor was Paul Edwards, who at the time was editing the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So it was kind of a big deal to be his student, although he hated Ayn Rand. So this is the first time I was playing coy. I never let on in his class, and he taught a wonderful Hume class, that I had any fondness of Rand. He would bring up Rand and bash her on his own, and I remained silent. I never did that afterwards, but that was too important strategical move for me to get out of there with an MA. So I said, what the hell, I'm not going to try to fight battles that are really, a side issue for me. NYU was very, very busy. Graduate classes had 75 students in them. Professors had, 20 students line up for their office hours. It was just too much of a mob scene. So I decided I was going to come back to the West Coast where things were a little more manageable. So I got accepted at UC Santa Barbara, which had a kind of it was a shadow Berkeley kind of department. The big stars were at Berkeley, but the not so big stars, but still quite formidable people from Harvard and Princeton and Cornell and so on ended up teaching at UC Santa Barbara. And so I went there, and I must say I had a great time there. Now, unfortunately, the academic marketplace started to turn. It was the end of the 60s. The students started to shoot themselves in the foot and alienate almost all the people who might have supported public education, including the University of California. So by the time I got my degree, it was not that easy to get a job. But I did. And at first I went to work at Bakersfield, California State University at Bakersfield. And I was there for 2 years. I had my run-ins with them too because I made the mistake. There I did make the mistake of giving a public lecture to the entire faculty about how insidious public education was, which did not stand me in good stead with the administration. They just opened this school, and they were very eager about being perceived by the community as a vital part. And so some upstart assistant professor denouncing public education was perhaps not a prudent thing. But I was beginning to realize that you can easily sell out if you start compromising, if you start caving in to pressures like that. You lose your credibility, at least to yourself. And so I eventually left there, went to SUNY Fredonia, where we had a great department. I was staying for 10 years. I got tenure, but then if I left tenure because my then wife couldn't find a job there, so we went back to Santa Barbara. We started with the Reason Foundation. We purchased Reason magazine from Lanny Friedlander in 1969 and put it on a regular basis of publishing monthly, and it's still running. And now I'm not that close to them anymore, but it was a nice thing to start. And there are lots of other things. I also edited a little journal, Reason Papers, for 25 years, which is now being edited by Irfan, by the way, and his wife. So I have managed to get a little mileage out of my philosophy education, not just for my own personal satisfaction, but also to make a little bit of a difference here and there. And the books that you have mentioned, Capitalism and Individualism, came out of my interest in, again, something that Rand advised, and I just followed through with that, and that is to reconcile economics with the normative dimension of life. Because the economists were so avid about denouncing any values. And I never thought that made any sense at all. And in fact, ultimately, I think the left took advantage of that because they realized it didn't make any sense. And they caught them saying, you know, you guys are just apologists for capitalism. Now, they weren't apologists for capitalism. They were actually scientists of prosperity, you know. But prosperity is a good thing. And so in Capitalism and Individualism, I have a subtitle called Reframing the Argument for the Free Society and making it more normative and less aridly positivist. And I do battle there with the neoclassicals, the Chicago school, as well as the Austrian school, and try to show that there is really no harm in having values as the foundation of your discipline, because then once you recognize that, you can work out the logic of it. But you can't deny that, for example, underlying a analysis of the market economy, you have to acknowledge property rights, which is a normative feature of the system. And to deny that is just nonsense. And then, you know, I went on to many, many other things. I wrote a little book called The Moral Case for the Free Market System. And then, of course, I was probably one of the very first ones that put together a book on libertarianism, The Libertarian Alternative, which was an edited volume published in 1973. And it has almost everybody in it. And I was lucky. I couldn't get Rand in it because then, you know, Rand blackballed me back in 1963. Actually, it was Nathan who blackballed me, who sent me a letter saying, you have been declared persona non grata, because we got into a fight, you know, an argument. And I think Rand was probably right. She didn't want to have to be bogged down with little petty fights with some of her acolytes, you know, and I was an acolyte, and I, you know, insulted her, and you know, at first she was very nice to me. I have a beautiful letter from her, and then later on she became not so nice. But what the hell, you know, that's just gossip, and it's not really important. What's important that the Libertarian Alternative included Brandon's essay from the USC Law School journal on free will and the law, which I think is a classic, and I think he has never gotten enough credit for having laid out the case so very nicely. I recently sent a copy of it to Steve Pinker at Harvard because I was so impressed with it, and I wanted to show Steve that I don't shy away from defending this Brandon guy, even though he's not as academically prominent as you are, you know. So I'm waiting for his response. I don't know whether he'll ever respond.